Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. From Eden to eternity, the Bible tells one big story of redemption. My name is Tiffany, and I want to spend a few minutes with you every day walking through the Bible chronologically. Together, we will explore God's sovereign plan as the events of Scripture unfold and point to Jesus. Hey friends, welcome back to the podcast. Tiffany here, and our journey through Ezekiel continues today with chapters 20 through 21. Over the past few days, we've studied several parables that taught us more about Judah's demise, but also the restoration provided through Jesus Christ. Today, we take a brief break from the parables and will instead further understand God's judgment through imagery. In both chapters, we will see God's glory and sovereignty on display as He holds each and every event of history in His hands. In chapter 20, we read that the elders once again approach Ezekiel to inquire of the Lord. These elders were the leaders of the captives already in Babylon. But even though they were far removed from their homeland, they still struggled with the same sins. God's answer to these elders is to remind them of their sinful history and why He has acted on behalf of their sinful nation over and over again. As you read this chapter, I hope all that we've studied so far concerning Israel's history sounded familiar. How the Lord called Israel out of Egypt to a land flowing with milk and honey, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, and again on the banks of the Jordan before the second generation entered the Promised Land. His great care for them, even in their 40-year wandering. And yet, at every turn, the people rejected the Lord's ordinances, profaned the Sabbath, and their hearts went after idols. God continually showed the people great mercy and withheld His wrath. But it wasn't for their sake. It was for His. You likely noticed a particular phrase repeated as the Lord recounted Israel's history. After each section, He stated His reason for withholding His wrath. The Lord said, "But I acted for the sake of my name, so that it would not be profaned in the eyes of the nations." God's plan was always for His sake and His glory, and His plan always included the nations. Though Israel sinned and chose to worship pagan idols, God kept His promises to make His name known throughout the world. This history lesson for these elders was to show them that their hearts were still just as idolatrous as their fellow Israelites still in Judah and their ancestors before them. They had no right to inquire of the Lord. He owed them nothing, and He would continue to fulfill His plan and purpose, even through His judgment on Judah. But restoration was also part of God's plan. Even though Israel would be scattered among the nations in exile, just as the Lord promised, He will also gather them back as promised. He will do this for the reason we read in verse 41, which says, "I will demonstrate my holiness through you in the sight of the nations." The nations will witness God's restoration of His people to Jerusalem. It will be an example and foreshadowing to them of all the future restoration found in Jesus Christ. And one day, people from every tribe, tongue, and nation will worship the Lord around the throne. All this will be for the sake of His name and glory. At the tail end of chapter 20, the Lord's message shifts to one filled with imagery for Judah's coming judgment. He has Ezekiel turn to the south, facing where Jerusalem would lie in relation to Babylon, and he prophesies against the forest land. Judah represents the forest. Babylon is the fire, and God is the one who will ignite it. Though these elders of Israel, who are already in captivity, think that Ezekiel is just sharing parables, God's message in chapter 21 will show that this devouring fire is very real, and it is coming for Judah. In chapter 21, the Lord speaks through Ezekiel and proclaims to Judah and the Israelite elders in Babylon that he will draw his sword of judgment. Over 15 times in this chapter, the Lord draws his sword from its sheath to bring judgment on Judah. He places this sword in the hands of the Babylonians. This sword is drawn for slaughter and great massacre. The exiles already in Babylon will groan at the news of this great destruction on their brothers and sisters in Judah. The word of the Lord continues as Ezekiel describes King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians coming to a fork in the road. One leads to Jerusalem, and the other leads to the Ammonites on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Even though Nebuchadnezzar's priests will use divination to seemingly choose which road to take, it is the Lord who will direct them to Jerusalem, and the city will become a ruin. But that doesn't mean the Ammonites won't face destruction as well. Even though the Babylonians will go to Jerusalem first, they will destroy the Ammonites too. We read about this back in Jeremiah chapter 49, and we will read about it again in Ezekiel chapter 25. Babylon would defeat the Ammonites just over 4 years after Jerusalem was destroyed. God handed the sword of judgment to Babylon, and they were his instrument to discipline the lands and nations who rebelled against him. And all of this was done for the sake of the Lord's name. God's justice and wrath are part of his mercy and compassion to bring about restoration. Though these chapters are hard, and we can wonder why we are reading about Jerusalem's destruction yet again, these chapters remind us of the cost of sin. They remind us just how much Jesus paid on the cross, and they lead us to rejoice in the gift of salvation and restoration. Don't lose heart in these hard and difficult chapters, my friends. Use this time to rejoice in our gracious and compassionate God. Thanks for joining me today. I'll meet you back here tomorrow. Bye, friends.